Welcome to Houston Newsmakers EXTRA. I'm talking with Dr. James Douglas, former president, provost, TSU, immediate past president of the NAACP. We've been talking about civil rights in Houston, and one of the things we're talking off camera about the influence for you was HISD and its resistance to integration.
Yes. Like I was telling you earlier, Cashmere Gardens was a white neighborhood, so I'm growing up playing with these white kids. And I know that they're not as smart as I am, but I'm reading the paper every day that the reason HISD won't integrate is African Americans can't compete academically with white kids, and they didn't want to dumb down the white schools by having these African Americans go. I'm not going to tell you what that did to me, but one of the things that it caused, a decision it caused me to make, was that I was going to an HBCU, because I said to myself, you're going to be successful. Mm-hmm. I knew I was going to be successful. But I also said to myself, I want to have all of my college professors to be African American, because I didn't want a white person to ever be able to take credit for my success.
And that was basically the seed planted by HISD saying, we're going to. Now, they eventually did that, and I found it interesting that the NAACP, at some point in time, this again involved Harris County, the Houston branch was really very active, had to almost go to the Supreme Court in order to get the Democrats, black Democrats, to be able to vote in Harris County's Democratic primary. That was a big deal for the Houston.
Yeah, but see, people have to realize that until really the early 60s, when Kennedy was elected, prior to that, most African Americans were Republicans. Mm-hmm. They were not Democrats. But you're right. It took a suit by the NAACP to force the Democratic Party to allow African Americans to vote in the primary, and you know, it was crazy during that time. I ended up reading a lot of books. I told you, having moved into a white neighborhood, I realized when I was in high school, I was reading all these novels on blockbusting. So I knew a lot about what happens when black families move into a white neighborhood. It just subconsciously, I didn't even realize that I was drawn to that just based on my own experience. But yeah, my background had a lot to do with me being involved in the civil rights movement, but more important, living and playing and being around white people all the time let me know that I could compete. Mm-hmm. And so I never felt inferior academically or any other way to anybody. So
equality has always been one of the things that the NAACP has been fighting for. So how do you transmit that kind of attitude to the kids and everybody else around you, both at TSU and with the programs that NAACP was putting in?
One of the things I said to the younger people in NAACP, it's much more difficult for them to fight the battle that they fight than it was for me to fight the battle that I fought. Because at that time, every African American in this country was hurt by segregation. Every African American, it didn't matter whether you were professional or laborer, whether you were rich or poor, it didn't matter. If you were African American, you were an African American, and you had to deal with segregation. Now everyone doesn't hurt the same. So we're splintered. We don't have communities anymore. So it's how do you bring a dispersed group of people back together? Mm-hmm. We don't have a black church anymore, because the black mega churches, most of the people that go to black mega churches don't live in the black community. Even the pastors of most of the black mega churches don't live in the black community. So it's a lot more difficult for them today. And I've been finding out the last few weeks, most people, I'm not just talking about African Americans, white people, most people don't even realize what segregation was all about. I'm discovering in and last night I was on a panel. People were really shocked. They assumed that segregation was whites against all minorities. They didn't realize it was just blacks and everybody else. There was no law that says Hispanics can't go to school with white students. There was no law that said Asians can't go to school with white students. There were no laws that says Native Americans can't go to school with white students. And they did. The laws only says blacks can't go to school with white students. I mean, you look at Rice University.
Right.
Hispanics have been going and graduating from Rice from its inception. It was blacks can't go to Rice.
And I noticed that, I mean, with restaurants and things like that, people who own restaurants, they can always put up a sign and say, because I've seen those signs that say no blacks or Hispanics, no Mexicans, that's what the sign would say.
Right.
So I know that was out there. So how now does the NAACP remain relevant? Because the fight that was in the 50s and 60s is not the fight that's in the 20s.
It's not the fight, it's not the, well, I won't say it's not the same fight. The methodology for dealing with the issue has changed. It's still, race is still the impetus for most of the problems in American society. So we still have to fight this racial issue. But because it is not de jure, we don't have the laws on the books, it's more de facto. That is, the law doesn't say you can't discriminate, but that doesn't stop me from discriminating just because the law doesn't say it. And so now you have to have a different mechanism. And people don't really understand one of the major differences between now and then is the world is not looking at America the same way it did in the 50s and 60s. We are not pitted against the Soviet Union. So remember, during the 50s and 60s, the fight was, what are the rest of the third world nations going to become? Are they going to become communist? Are they going to become democratic? And so it was the United States against Soviet Union. And most of the countries that we were after happened to be countries of color. See, nobody realizes that the same pressure the world put on South Africa to end apartheid is the same pressure that the world put on the United States to end apartheid. When people saw those films of the fire hoses and the dogs in Montgomery, they went worldwide. Right. They started putting pressure on the United States just like we put pressure on South Africa. Nobody wants to say that America we had an apartheid in America just like South Africa did, but we did.
We don't now, so now
we don't.
How does the NAACP remain relevant?
The NAACP remain relevant is because we don't have the laws on the books. It doesn't mean that we don't have the same problem. We still have the same problem, but we can't use the same techniques that we used back in the 50s.
So you think there's still more to be done?
Oh, I know there's more to be done. I know there's more to be done. All you have to do is look around the country and see what's happening in the world today. I don't care whether it's open carry, which has a negative impact on the African American community. I don't care whether it's the war on drugs, which destroyed the African American family. We have a lot to look forward to and a lot of issues. We allowed the war on drugs to destroy the African American family. People say, well, what happened to it? Well, we put everybody in prison. Most of the young African Americans in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, a substantial portion of them ended up in prison, and they not only can't they make a contribution to society, but they can't even take care of themselves. They can't get apartments, they can't get jobs, they can't even get an education because the law says if you got a felony drug charge, you can't get financial aid. So we have really created a problem for the African American family that we have to deal with.
How optimistic are you? Final comment from you about how optimistic you are that you've been optimistic all your life, hopefully, that things are going to change. How optimistic are you that they will?
Oh, I'm extremely optimistic. I tell people every day, you know, Moses wandered through the wilderness for 40 years before he never saw the promised land. But God tests us sometimes, and he has definitely tested the African American community. But I wouldn't be fighting the way I am if I was not optimistic first bent. Now, I say that because we, even though we have a long ways to go, we have come a long ways. America, racially, is not the same America that it was when I was growing up. I mean, there are a lot of more negative things, but there are a lot more positive things. When I tell people that in the 9th grade, when I said I wanted to be a lawyer, and all my counselors and my teachers and everybody said to me, "You're crazy. A black lawyer cannot make a living in Houston. You have a science background, all right? Why would you not want to go into a profession where you can make a living?" I tell people, a guy named Andrew Jefferson. Andrew Jefferson was a black lawyer. Andrew Jefferson took a job in Houston, where used to be the old Umber Law, but is now Exxon, on their legal staff. I tell people, and people are shocked, that was in 1968 when I was in law school. That was the first black lawyer to be hired by a corporation in Houston, not a law firm, because the law firms were still not hiring any black lawyers. 1968, before a black company in Houston hired, a white company in Houston hired an African American lawyer. So people don't realize how far we've come from a point when people were telling me, "You'd never make a living as a lawyer in Houston," where I go to school every day and I sit in front of all of these African American students who are training to become lawyers, and I see the opportunities that they have that were not there when I was sitting where they're sitting. I had a hiring partner from Baker Botts tell me when I was a law student, they had never gotten an application from an African American. That was why they never they had never hired anyone, because no African Americans had ever applied.
A lot going on. Great history. One of 8 kids, so you're 9 kids altogether.
9.
9 kids altogether, and all of you went to college.
Yes.
Great story. Dr. Douglas, thank you for being a guest this week. We look forward to continue to watch what you're doing on the trail, because I know you're still active doing what you can. So,
right.
James Douglas, civil rights activist, still active even now. You won't retire.
Never thought about it.
See there. Houston Newsmakers Extra. Share with everybody you know.